Preston Vale straightened his jacket, looked Silas Corbett dead in the eye, and held out a folded envelope thick with cash. "Take it," he said. "Every dollar you'd earn in 6 months. Walk away from Red Willow tonight, and nobody has to know you were fool enough to think a carpenter belongs in the same room as Lenora Holloway." Silas didn't reach for the envelope. Preston stepped closer. "I'm not asking. I'm telling you how this ends for you." The money sat there between them, like a verdict. If you've ever watched someone try to buy another person's dignity with a smile on their face, you already know exactly what kind of man Preston Vale was. This is a story about what happens when the wrong man underestimates the right one, and about a woman who saw the difference long before anyone else did. If you're new here, subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to know how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button before we're done. The town of Red Willow didn't look like much from the road coming in. Silas Corbett had ridden into enough settlements over the past 9 years to know the difference between a town that was growing and a town that only thought it was. Red Willow was the second kind wide main street, freshly painted storefronts, the smell of ambition that hadn't quite figured out yet what it was building toward. The kind of place that put up a courthouse before it had enough lawyers to fill it. The kind of place that was always announcing itself. He didn't plan to stay long enough for it to matter. His wagon rolled past the livery, past the dry goods store with its hand-lettered sign in the window, past 2 men arguing over a fence post in a way that suggested they'd been arguing about that fence post for considerably longer than the fence post deserved. Silas watched them without turning his head. He'd seen that argument in 7 different territories. The fence post always lost. The Holloway Ranch sat 2 miles east of town proper, up a long approach road that cut through open grassland before the main house came into view. Silas saw it from a quarter-mile out and felt something shift in his chest, not admiration exactly, but a professional's involuntary response to scale. The house was 3 stories, timber and stone, built with the kind of money that didn't need to advertise itself because the structure did the talking. Whoever had put that house up understood proportion. The roofline was clean, the foundation sat correctly. Someone had actually thought about it. He pulled his wagon around to the side entrance and climbed down, rolling his shoulders. A man named Dawson, who worked the property as a general hand, met him at the gate and walked him through the main points of the commission. Garrick Holloway, the ranch and freight owner, had left 3 days prior for Denver to negotiate a railroad contract. He'd be gone several weeks. His daughter was supervising the renovation work in his absence. "She know what she wants done?" Silas asked. Dawson gave him a sideways look. "Miss Lenora knows exactly what she wants done. That's not your problem. Your problem is keeping up." Silas didn't know what to do with that, so he carried his tool chest inside and got to work. He expected Garrick Holloway's daughter to be what most wealthy men's daughters were, in his experience, pleasant enough, largely decorative, interested in surfaces and finishes without any understanding of what created them. He'd worked for that type before. They pointed at things and said words like charming and rustic without knowing what either one actually meant. He could build what they wanted. He just didn't have to enjoy the conversation. The first time he met Lenora Holloway, she was standing in what would become her new bedroom, holding one end of a measuring tape against the far wall with her shoulder, the other end pinched between 2 fingers at exactly the right height to mark where she wanted the headboard to sit. She had pulled her dark hair back, practically, was wearing a work apron over a plain dress, and was writing measurements in a small notebook without looking up when he came in. "You're the carpenter," she said. Not a question. "Silas Corbett." "Yes." "Good," she finished writing. "Come look at this wall." He came and looked at the wall. "The plaster's sound," he said. "I know the plaster's sound. Look at the window frame." He looked at the window frame. Then he looked more carefully. The frame had been installed slightly, out of level barely, maybe 3/16 of an inch, which wouldn't affect anything structurally, but would create a gap on the left side once new trim was set against it. Whoever had installed it originally had done a fast job. Most people wouldn't notice for years, if ever. It would just be one of those things about a room that felt slightly wrong without anyone knowing why. "You caught that," he said. "My father didn't." Lenora finally looked up from the notebook. She had steady gray eyes and the kind of face that gave nothing away unless it chose to. "He had another man do this room 8 years ago. I've been looking at that frame ever since. I can fix it. Add half a day. I know you can fix it. That's why I'm telling you. She turned back to her notebook. Bed frame goes here. Oak, not pine. I'll show you the design I sketched. She showed him the design she sketched. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't elaborate. It was thought through, the proportions correct. The joinery marked more understanding than most people who hadn't built a day in their lives could have managed. She'd drawn the mortise and tenon connections at the corners. She'd noted where she wanted the grain to run on the headboard panels. She'd included a small detail on the footboard that was purely aesthetic, but showed she understood the difference between decoration that came from the structure and decoration that was merely applied on top of it. Silas looked at the sketch for a long moment. Who taught you to draw plans like this? Lenora didn't smile, exactly, but something around her eyes shifted. My mother, before she passed. She wanted to be an architect. Women didn't do that in her time. She drew furniture instead. She was good. I know. She closed the notebook. I want the bed done before anything else. My father's bedroom can wait. He started on the bed that afternoon. The lumber he'd brought wasn't quite right. The oak he'd selected at the mill in the last town had one board with a subtle cup in it, barely visible but enough that it would telegraph through a finished surface over time if he used it in a prominent panel. He set it aside and sent Dawson into town for a replacement from the local mill. Most carpenters wouldn't have caught it or wouldn't have cared. Silas cared. He didn't entirely know why he still cared after 9 years of building things for people he'd never see again, but he did. Lenora came in 2 hours later with coffee, 2 cups, no ceremony, set one beside his tools without asking if he wanted it, and stood looking at the board he'd pulled from the stack. What's wrong with it? Cup in the grain. Just enough. She picked up the board and sighted down it the way you'd sight down a rifle barrel. Then she set it back down. You're right. I wouldn't have caught that. Most people don't. Most people aren't building my bed. She sat on an overturned crate and drank her coffee and didn't say anything more for a while. She wasn't watching him the way people usually watched craftsmen, that self-conscious performance of interest that was really just killing time. She was watching the actual work, the way his hands moved, the choices he made without explaining them, the sequence of what came first. She was reading it the way you'd read a book. It was strange. He wasn't sure he liked it. He also wasn't sure he disliked it. You move like someone who's done this since he was young, she said eventually. 13 years old. My uncle's shop. And you've been traveling since? 9 years. By choice? He kept his hands moving. That's a complicated question. Most honest answers are. She stood and took her empty cup. Supper's at 6. Dawson will tell you where. She left. Silas looked at the doorway she'd walked through for a moment, then turned back to his work. Over the next 2 days, something started happening that he didn't have a good word for. He became aware of her presence in a way that had nothing to do with attraction, or not only to do with it anyway. It was more that she moved through the house with a purposefulness that he recognized, the way one craftsman recognizes another's quality of attention without needing to discuss it. She was always doing something. She wasn't decorative. She wasn't waiting for her life to begin. She came back that second afternoon and found him fitting the tenon joints on the headboard frame. She watched for a while, then asked, "Do you cut those freehand or mark them first?" "Mark them first. Cutting freehand makes you feel skilled. Marking first makes you accurate. Which do you prefer?" "Accurate." She was quiet for a moment. Then most men would say skilled. Most men are building things that need to look good for 10 years. I build things that need to hold for 50. She didn't respond immediately. When she did, it was quiet, almost to herself. I've never heard someone explain the difference like that before. He wasn't sure what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. He went back to fitting the joint. She stayed another half hour, and then left again without announcement, which was something else he was starting to notice. She didn't perform her exits any more than she performed her entrances. She arrived, she left. She didn't wait to see if you were watching. By the end of the 3rd day, the bed was finished. Silas stood back and looked at it the way he always looked at finished work, not with satisfaction exactly, but with the particular critical calm of a man checking his own accounting. Proportions were right. The joints were tight. The headboard panels showed the grain the way Lenora's sketch had indicated. The footboard detail sat correctly within the larger form, earned by the structure rather than applied to it. He packed his hand tools into their rolls. He set the larger tools back in his chest. He carried the chest downstairs to the entrance hall, set it beside his coat, and was reaching for his coat when a voice came from behind him. "Who said your work was done?" He turned. Lenora was standing at the bottom of the staircase. She'd changed out of the work apron, but her expression was the same, not amused, not sharp, just watching him with that steady attention that he'd been noticing for 3 days. "The bed's finished," he said. "I know the bed's finished." That was the first item on the list. There are other items on the list. He'd seen the list. He'd seen the full commission bed frame, writing desk, bookcase for the study, porch railing replacement, and some general repairs around the house that Dawson had showed him. But the way Garrick had described the job, and the way men usually describe jobs, Silas had understood the bed to be the primary item, the anchor. Once that was done, he'd expected to negotiate timing on the rest. Lenora walked to the small table beside the entrance and picked up a folded paper. She opened it and held it out. He took it and read it. It was detailed. More detailed than anything Garrick had mentioned. The writing desk wasn't just a writing desk, it was a specific design with dimensions, drawer configurations, and a pull-out surface extension that would require some engineering to execute correctly. The bookcase needed to be built around an existing window alcove in a way that accounted for the window casing. Porch railing replacement involved not just the rail itself but the posts, which had rotted at the base. There were also several additional items that he was fairly certain hadn't been part of the original discussion: a storage cabinet for the kitchen, trim work in the upstairs hallway, and something described only as workshop shelving, dimensions to be determined. He looked up from the paper. Workshop shelving. "We have a carriage house that hasn't been used in 3 years. I've been meaning to convert it into a proper workspace." "For what?" Lenora looked at him steadily. "For whatever I decide to build in it." Silas looked back down at the list. He was aware of something, a particular quality of the silence between them, the kind that happens when two people are saying something without using words yet. He knew what she was doing. She was giving him reasons to stay. He knew she knew he knew. What he didn't know was why that didn't make him want to leave faster. He folded the paper carefully. "The writing desk is going to take some thinking. The drawer extension you've described, the way you want the grain to run, I'm going to need to look at the space before I commit to dimensions. I can show you now." "All right." They went upstairs. She showed him the alcove where the desk would sit, described how she worked standing sometimes, sitting others, always with papers spread wider than a standard desk allowed, and explained the extension mechanism she'd been imagining, without the technical vocabulary to name it, but with enough precision that he understood exactly what she meant. He asked 3 questions. She answered all 3 without hesitating. He crouched down and looked at the floor, the window light, the angle of the south-facing wall in afternoon. He could see the desk already. Not just its dimensions, but the way it would sit in that particular corner, the way it would change the room. "I can build that," he said. "I know you can." She was watching him think about it. "That's why I hired you." He stood. "Your father hired me." "My father hired a carpenter." She said it without particular emphasis, like a correction that didn't need to be argued. "I hired you." He wasn't sure exactly when the difference between those 2 things had started to matter to him, but he thought about it for longer than he should have while he carried his tool chest back upstairs and began to set up for the second job. That evening, he sat on the bunkhouse step where the hands slept and turned the day over in his mind, the way you turn a problem piece of wood, looking for the grain. He'd left 17 towns in 9 years. He'd built things in all of them, good things, things that would last, and he'd walked away from every one of them without looking back, because looking back was a habit that didn't serve the kind of life he'd arranged for himself. There was always another commission, always another town that needed what he could do. He told himself he liked it. He told himself the movement was the point. But sitting on that step in the Colorado evening, with the first stars just showing at the edge of the sky, Silas Corbett did something he hadn't done in a long time. He tried to think of the name of someone in the last town who had looked at his work the way Lenora Holloway looked at his work. He couldn't. He couldn't think of the town before that either. He thought about a woman who had wanted to be an architect, and had drawn furniture instead, and about a daughter who had learned to read a design sketch the way most people read a familiar letter, quickly, fluently, with recognition rather than study. He thought about 3/16 of an inch in a window frame that 8 years hadn't fixed. He went inside and went to sleep. The next morning he started on the writing desk. He spent an hour before breakfast just sitting with the wood, running his hands over the boards he'd selected, checking the moisture content by feel, reading the grain. You couldn't rush the reading. The wood told you what it wanted to do, and if you listened before you started cutting, you saved yourself the argument of fighting it later. Most people thought carpentry was about imposing shape. Silas had learned young that it was mostly about cooperation. Lenora came in at mid-morning with coffee again, and this time she brought her notebook. "Can I ask you something while you work?" "You can ask." "Why do you always start by just sitting with the wood?" "You did it yesterday, too, with the headboard stock." "Reading it." "Reading what?" He held up one of the boards for her and angled it toward the window light. "See how the grain runs? Just slightly off straight here. Curves a little at this end. That's going to want to move in one direction when the moisture changes. If I put this piece here," he tapped the section, he meant it'll fight me every time the weather changes. "If I put it here instead, it moves with the structure rather than against it." She looked at the board. She looked for a while. "You're thinking 20 years ahead." "Have to. I'm not going to be here to fix it." The words came out before he'd thought about them. There was a moment of quiet. "No," Lenora said. "I suppose you won't." Neither of them said anything more for a minute. Then Lenora opened her notebook. "The drawer extension, I've been thinking about how the mechanism should work. Can I show you what I drew?" She showed him. What she'd drawn was essentially a functioning wood slide with a stop, simpler than a metal hardware solution, and more reliable in the dry Colorado climate. It wasn't quite the most elegant execution, but the principle was sound, and she'd actually worked out the proportions correctly. "That works," he said. She looked up. He could tell she hadn't expected him to say it so directly. "You thought I'd gotten it wrong," she said. "I thought you might have." "You didn't, but you thought it. I don't assume." "I check. There's a difference." She looked at him for a moment, and he had the uncomfortable feeling of being read the way he read the wood carefully, patiently, without rushing to a conclusion. He wasn't sure he liked it. He went back to work. Over the next several days, something changed in the texture of their interactions. It wasn't dramatic. Nothing announced itself. But the conversations grew longer. And they began to have the quality of conversations between people who are no longer performing politeness, where one person says the actual thing they mean, and the other responds to that, rather than to the socially acceptable version. She told him one afternoon that she'd refused 2 marriage proposals in the past 4 years. She said it without drama, like a piece of information. "Same man?" he asked. "2 different men, both chosen by my father. Both decent enough in their way." She paused. "Both men who wanted my father's freight connections more than they wanted any particular future with me. You knew that, within about 2 weeks both times." He thought about that. How? Lenora was quiet for a moment. "Because neither of them ever asked me what I wanted. They asked my father what I needed. They had a picture of what I was, and they were building toward that picture." She looked at the desk frame, taking shape under his hands. "It's like buying a piece of furniture without caring about the person who's going to use it. You can get the dimensions technically right and still get it completely wrong." He kept his hands moving. "That's a good analogy. I've had time to think about it." He glanced up at her. "What do you want?" She looked surprised, not offended, but genuinely surprised, the way someone looks when they've been waiting for a question and had stopped expecting it. "To build something," she said. "Not run something my father built, and not decorate something a husband builds. I want to start something that didn't exist before I started it." "The workshop." "Yes. What would you make in it?" She smiled for the first time, a real smile, not the polite, almost smile he'd seen before. It made her look younger and more sure of herself at the same time. "I don't know yet. Maybe furniture. Maybe something else. I just know I need a place that's mine to find out." Silas looked at the desk frame. He thought about what she'd said. He thought about 17 towns and 17 jobs and what he'd built in all of them, and whether any of it had been his in the way she was describing. Something started from nothing. something that hadn't existed before he decided it would. He realized he didn't know. That realization sat in his chest for the rest of the afternoon in a way that was difficult to name and impossible to shake. 4 days later, two things happened that changed the shape of everything. The first, that Silas finished a rough sketch of his own, a plan for the carriage house conversion. He hadn't been asked to. He'd done it at night, on the back of a piece of brown paper, while the bunkhouse was quiet. He drew the layout for a proper workshop tool storage. Workbench placement, overhead shelving configured around the natural light from the east-facing windows, a small office area at the back where plans and counts could be managed. He drew it the way he'd have drawn it for himself, which meant he drew it correctly. He left the sketch on the workbench where Lenora worked alongside him, without comment, before she arrived in the morning. He was halfway through his second cup of coffee when she came in and found it. She stood there and looked at it for a long time. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bright, and she looked at him with an expression he didn't have a category for yet. "You drew this for me," she said. "Someone needs to." His voice came out rougher than he intended. Carriage house has good bones, but the layout needs thinking through before you start pulling shelves off walls and putting them somewhere worse. She looked back at the drawing. The office at the back, you put it so the windows face east. Morning light for paperwork, afternoon light for the bench. You'd want it the other way around. She was quiet for a moment. Then very quietly, "How did you know that's how I work?" He hadn't known he'd known it. But he'd noticed the way she wrote in the morning, the way she handled physical things in the afternoon, the pattern of when she went still to think and when she moved to act. He'd been noticing without intending to. The way you notice things about a house you've been living in long enough that you stop seeing it and start knowing it. "I pay attention," he said. The second thing that happened was that Dawson came to find him in the afternoon. "Ryder came up from town," Dawson said, and the way he said it told Silas the news wasn't simple. "Mr. Holloway's coming back. Tomorrow early. And he's not coming alone." Silas set down his plane. "Who's he bringing?" Dawson looked at him with the expression of a man delivering a warning he doesn't fully understand the shape of yet. "A man named Preston Vale. Denver money, railroad money. Miss Lenora knows him, met him once before, I think." Dawson paused. "Word is Mr. Holloway thinks very highly of the man." Silas looked at the workshop sketch on the bench. "Word from who?" Ryder brought a letter. Miss Lenora read it out loud. "Well," Dawson corrected himself. She read part of it out loud. The rest she folded up and put in her pocket and didn't say anything more about. Silas thought about a woman who had refused 2 marriage proposals from men chosen by her father. He thought about a carriage house with good bones and a workshop that didn't exist yet. He thought about the way Lenora had looked at his drawing that morning and the particular quality of the silence that followed, and how he didn't have the right word for what was in it, but knew with a craftsman's precision that it was real. Then he picked up his plane and went back to work, because the desk wasn't finished, and Silas Corbett finished what he started. But that night on the bunkhouse step, he sat with the Colorado sky and the beginning of something cold in the air that had nothing to do with weather, and he thought about what Dawson had said, and what it probably meant, and what it was going to cost to find out if he was right. He sat there a long time. The stars came out fully. The ranch house went dark window by window. One window on the second floor stayed lit longer than the others. Lenora's. He watched it without meaning to, until it finally went dark, and then he went inside and lay in the dark for a while before sleep came, which was longer than usual, and in a different way. Garrick Holloway rode in just after 7 in the morning, before the dew had finished burning off the grass. Silas heard the horses from the workshop alcove, where he was fitting the drawer slides on Lenora's desk. He didn't stop working. He listened to the sound of arrival, 2 horses, not one, moving at the unhurried pace of men who owned the ground they were crossing, and he kept his hands moving and his mind on the fit of the slide mechanism, which needed another 1/16 of an inch on the left channel, or it would bind every time the weather shifted. He heard Garrick's voice in the yard, deep, carrying, the voice of a man accustomed to being heard across distances. He heard another voice beneath it, smoother, measured, the kind of voice that had been trained rather than grown. He didn't hear Lenora. He noticed that. 10 minutes later, Dawson appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Holloway wants to see the work." I'll be done with this joint in about 4 minutes. Dawson looked at him. He said, "Now I heard what he said." Silas set the slide carefully against the frame and marked the adjustment point with a pencil. 4 minutes. Dawson left. Silas finished the joint. Then he cleaned his hands on his work rag, rolled down his sleeves, and went out to the main entrance where Garrick Holloway was standing with the particular stance of a man surveying his own property feet wide, arms crossed loosely, chin slightly elevated. Garrick was in his late 50s, broad through the chest, with a gray-shot beard and the kind of weathered face that came from decades of actual outdoor work rather than the decorative kind. He was not a soft man. Silas had built enough things for powerful men to recognize the real ones on sight, and Garrick Holloway was real, whatever else he was. He'd earned what he had with his hands and his will before he'd earned it with his money. Beside him stood Preston Vale. Preston was perhaps 40, perhaps a year or two either side. He was dressed well without being overdressed, which was the more dangerous kind of well-dressed. It signaled that he understood the difference between showing off and projecting confidence. He was clean-shaven, with sharp eyes that moved quickly across a room and catalogued what they found there. He looked at Silas the way a man looks at a piece of furniture he's considering, assessing briefly, before deciding whether it was worth his attention. He decided it wasn't and looked away. "Corbett," Garrick said, and extended his hand. His grip was firm and brief businessman's handshake, not a laborer's. "Dawson tells me the bed is finished. 3 days ago." "Good. Walk me through what else is in progress." Silas walked him through it. Garrick asked specific questions about materials, about timeline, about whether the porch railing posts would need to be replaced entirely or just the top rail, and Silas answered them specifically, because Garrick was the kind of man who noticed when you padded an answer. Preston followed them through the house without speaking, hands in his jacket pockets, occasionally glancing at something with the look of a man who found the topic mildly beneath him, but was too polished to say so. When they reached Lenora's room, Garrick stood in front of the finished bed for a moment. "That's solid work," he said. It was a simple statement. He wasn't the kind of man who decorated his compliments. "It'll hold," Silas said. "I can see that." Preston looked at the bed. Then he looked at Silas. "How long for the remainder of the list?" "Depends on the workshop," Silas said. "If Miss Holloway has finalized what she wants done with the carriage house." "Carriage house isn't pressing," Garrick said, mildly but firmly. "Finish the desk and the indoor work first." Silas nodded. He noticed, without looking for it, that Lenora was standing in the doorway of the room. She had been there for at least 30 seconds. She hadn't said anything. She was watching her father look at her bed with an expression that Silas was starting to learn, the one where she kept her face still and her eyes did all the moving. "It's good work, Papa," she said. Garrick turned. "It is. Mr. Corbett has a good hand. I told him about the window frame." She said it directly, without cushioning it. "The one that's been off-level since Harmon did the room." Garrick's expression shifted, not quite discomfort, but the particular look of a man being reminded of something he'd been comfortable forgetting. That was 8 years ago. 8 years and 2 months, Lenora said pleasantly. Mr. Corbett fixed it Tuesday. Preston smiled. It was a good smile practiced, warm in the surface layer, nothing underneath it. "Lenora, you have a sharper eye than most contractors I've hired in Denver." He said it to her, but he was looking at Silas when he said it, making sure Silas understood who had hired contractors in Denver and who had fixed someone else's window frame. "Contractors in Denver work in offices," Lenora said. "I imagine their work looks very clean." Preston's smile held. "Indeed it does." The tour ended. Garrick and Preston went to the study to discuss whatever business had brought them back from Denver, and Silas returned to the desk, and the house settled back into its routines. But something had changed in the air of the place, the way air changes before weather, not the thing itself yet, just the pressure of it. That afternoon, Silas was in the side yard selecting boards for the porch rail posts when Preston Vale appeared. He came around the corner of the house, with his hands still in his jacket pockets, and the easy movement of a man who had decided to take a walk and had happened to end up here, which was the kind of thing that only worked on people who weren't paying attention. "Fine lumber," Preston said, looking at the boards Silas had laid out. "It'll do." Preston crouched down and picked up one end of a board, turned it over. He didn't know what he was looking for. Silas could see that immediately the way he held it, the angle, the lack of any actual sighting down the edge. He was performing the gesture, not executing it. "You've done good work here," Preston said, setting the board back. "Garrick speaks well of your trade. That's his business." "It is," Preston straightened. He was a few inches shorter than Silas, but held himself in a way that was supposed to compensate for it. "It's actually business I wanted to speak to you about, briefly. Man to man." Silas looked at him. "You've been here a few weeks," Preston said. "Long enough to get comfortable with the place, with the family. That's natural. It happens." He paused, giving the words room to be reasonable. "A man in your position, working in a house like this, around a woman like Lenora, it's easy to get ideas." "Is it?" "I'm not suggesting anything improper." Preston's tone was careful, managed. "I'm simply saying that some situations are clearer from the outside than they are from the inside. Garrick has plans for his daughter that have been in motion for some time. Good plans, plans that serve her well." He met Silas's eyes. "I wouldn't want a good craftsman to make a difficult situation for himself by misreading what's here." Silas finished straightening the boards. He took his time. "I'm here to build furniture and fix railings," he said. "That's what I'm doing." Preston studied him for a moment. Whatever he was looking for, he seemed to half find it. "Good. That's the right thinking." He looked out toward the carriage house. "The workshop project, Garrick mentioned it. I'd advise against encouraging that. Lenora has ideas, sometimes that sound better than they turn out to be. She needs guidance in that, not encouragement." Silas looked at him directly for the first time in the conversation. "What she needs isn't really my area," he said. "I build what I'm asked to build." Preston nodded slowly, like a man filing information. "Course." He turned to go. "Keep up the good work, Corbett." He walked back toward the house. Silas watched him go. He thought about the workshop sketch he'd drawn on brown paper. He thought about Lenora's face when she'd found it on the bench. He thought about Preston's voice saying the word guidance with the particular confidence of a man who had never questioned whether he was qualified to supply it. He picked up his board and went back to work. That evening at supper, which the hands took at a long table in the kitchen, with Dawson presiding and Garrick joining occasionally when he was of a mind to, Preston appeared with Garrick and sat at the end of the table with the ease of a man who had decided this was where he belonged. He talked well. He knew how to work a table, asking the right hands about their families, remembering a name from an earlier introduction, laughing at a joke with the right amount of appreciation. He was good at it. Silas watched him work the room and felt a cold, clear kind of understanding settle in his chest. Preston Vale was not stupid. He was not incompetent. He was skilled at exactly the things that mattered in the world he came from: the performance of warmth, the management of impressions, the gentle organization of other people's perceptions of their own best interests. That was a real ability. It had its uses. The problem was that Silas had spent 9 years building things that had to hold, and he'd developed a permanent allergy to anything that only looked solid. Lenora was not at supper. Dawson said she'd taken a tray to her room, which she sometimes did when she was working on something. Silas didn't ask what she was working on. He finished his meal and went back to the bunkhouse. And that night he lay on his bunk thinking about the drawer extension mechanism and the second board for the desktop surface, and whether the carriage house east wall had enough structural integrity to support overhead shelving, or whether it needed new cross members first. He was not thinking about Lenora. He was mostly not thinking about Lenora. The next morning she found him before he'd finished his first cup of coffee, which was early enough that it told him she'd been awake before that. She came into the workshop alcove with her notebook and set it on the bench and opened it without preamble. She'd been drawing again, not furniture this time, but the carriage house layout. She'd taken his sketch and extended it, working out the detail of the office corner, adding dimensions he hadn't included, noting where the natural light fell at what time of day, because she'd clearly been in there measuring it herself. She'd also added something he hadn't drawn. Against the back wall, she'd sketched a display area, a section of wall where finished pieces could be shown, where clients could come and see what the workshop produced before they commissioned their own. A showroom, he said, a small one, just enough. She looked at her drawing. If we're building things worth buying, people should be able to see them before they decide. He noticed the we. He didn't point at it. He looked at the dimensions she'd noted for the display wall and calculated the shelving load in his head. That back wall is going to need new cross members before it can hold display weight, he said. How long would that add? 3 days, maybe 4. Can you start this week? He looked at her. Your father said to finish the indoor work first. Lenora's jaw tightened, just slightly. The indoor work is nearly done. Nearly isn't done. She was quiet for a moment, looking at her drawing. Then, Preston told my father the workshop was a distraction. Last night, after supper. How do you know what they said after supper? My father's study is below my room. His window was open. She said it without apology. Preston told him that women who dabbled in trades generally found it was more trouble than it was worth, that I'd lose interest in 6 months, that the money would be better spent on, he said, establishing Lenora properly, and my father didn't disagree with him. Silas set his coffee cup down. He's been here 2 days, Silas said. He was here briefly last spring. My father liked him then. She closed the notebook. My father has been trying to find someone to manage me for 4 years. Not because he's cruel, because he's afraid. He thinks without a husband I'm exposed. She looked at Silas directly. Preston isn't interested in protecting me. He's interested in the freight business. I could see that last spring, and I can see it more clearly now. Have you told your father that? I've told my father that twice. Something in her expression closed briefly. He hears it as stubbornness. He thinks I'm afraid of commitment. He doesn't hear it as what it is, which is observation. Silas was quiet for a moment. What does Preston know about the freight business? Enough to want it. He has railroad contacts my father has been trying to access for years. Denver money, territorial influence. My father thinks a partnership through marriage would open those doors. She paused. He's probably right that it would. That's the part that makes it harder to argue against. Silas picked up a piece of trim he'd cut yesterday and ran his thumb along the edge, checking it. You're not going to win that argument with logic, he said. Your father already knows the logic. He's made his calculation. I know. So what are you going to do? Lenora was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was even, but something underneath it was not. I'm going to build something. Before my father makes a decision I can't undo. I'm going to build something that exists, that I started, that isn't his and isn't a husband's, so that when the conversation happens, and it's going to happen, I have something real to point to. She looked at her notebook. Not a sketch, something real. Silas looked at the trim piece in his hands. He set it down. Finish the desk today, he said. The desktop surface has 1 joint left. I'll have it done by noon. Then we go to the carriage house, and I'll assess the back wall. Lenora looked at him. For a moment, her composure shifted just slightly, the way a well-built door shifts in a frame when the temperature changes. Not structural, just real. Thank you, she said. I said I'd look at it. I haven't said I'll start this week. I know. But she was already opening her notebook again, and she was almost smiling. He finished the desk by 11:30. He set the last component, tested the drawer extension twice in and out, smooth but not loose, with the positive stop he'd engineered from a small hardwood block that would prevent the surface from pulling out too far, and stood back and looked at what he'd built. It was the right desk, for that corner, for that window, for the particular way Lenora Holloway worked. He knew that the way he knew a well-fitted joint, not from being told, but from the evidence in front of him. Lenora came in while he was cleaning the final sawdust from the surface with a soft cloth. She stood in the doorway and looked at the desk in its place. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she walked over and sat down in the chair he'd positioned in front of it. She'd asked him to leave room for a specific chair, had described its dimensions without having the chair with her, and he'd trusted the measurement and put her hands flat on the surface. She spread her papers out the way she'd described working, pulled the extension out, and set her notebook on it, and was still. It's exactly right, she said. The joint on the extension will loosen after a few years. Tap it back with a mallet, not a hammer. I know the difference. I know you do. She looked up at him. Something in her eyes was not about the desk. He knew it. She knew he knew it. They both let it sit there without moving it. Carriage house, he said. They went to the carriage house. It had been used for storage and had accumulated 3 years' worth of broken equipment, coiled rope, cracked harness leather, and the general debris of a working ranch that didn't have anywhere else to put things. The floor was dirt, packed hard. The east wall had 2 windows that let in good morning light. The structure was sound roof tight, main beams solid, no rot in the sill plates except for one section on the north side that was maybe 18 inches and manageable. Silas walked the back wall and pressed his hands against the framing at intervals, feeling for give. He found 2 places where the studs had dried and checked. Not dangerous. Problematic for heavy loading. The back wall needs sistering, he said. New studs alongside the checked ones. 3 days, maybe 2.5 if the lumber's ready. Lenora was measuring the east wall, writing numbers. The windows, can we add a 3rd one? On the south end. South wall is load-bearing. He looked at it. We could do a smaller window if we add a proper header. It would cost you maybe a half day extra. Do it. She said it without hesitation, then looked up. Is that too much? It's your workshop. I know it's my workshop. I'm asking if it's structurally too much. No, it's the right call. South light in the afternoon, east light in the morning. You'd have good working light most of the day. She wrote it down. Then she stood in the center of the carriage house and turned slowly, looking at all 4 walls. The ceiling, the dirt floor. She was seeing something he couldn't see yet, the future of the space, what it would become when it was finished. He recognized that look. He had it himself sometimes, when he walked into a building that wasn't done and could already see the thing it was turning into. It's going to be good, he said. She looked at him. Can see it too? Yeah. For a moment, standing in that dusty half-light with sawdust in the air and the smell of old leather and dry wood, something easy and unguarded passed between them, not romantic exactly. Or not only, particular warmth of 2 people who see the same thing at the same time and both know it. Then Garrick Holloway's voice came from the yard. Lenora. She straightened. The moment folded and put itself away. She went to the door of the carriage house, and Silas followed a step behind. Garrick was standing in the yard with Preston beside him. Both men were looking at the carriage house. Preston had a look on his face that was carefully neutral, which Silas had already learned, was the look Preston wore when he was thinking something he didn't want to say out loud yet. I thought you were supervising the indoor work, Garrick said. He said it to Lenora, but he was looking at Silas. The desk is finished, Papa. I asked Mr. Corbett to assess the carriage house while he had time. That wasn't on the original commission. It was on the extended list, which you reviewed. Garrick's jaw moved. He looked at the carriage house, then at Silas. What's your assessment? Sound structure. Needs some work on the back wall framing. 3 days to do it right, and then it's a solid space. For what purpose? The question was aimed at Silas, but it was meant for Lenora. Silas didn't answer it. After a beat, Lenora did, a workshop. Furniture and design commissions I've been planning it for. We've talked about this, Garrick said. Not unkindly, but with the finality of a man who has had a conversation and considers it concluded. We talked about it 6 months ago, and you said maybe. That's not the same as no. Preston cleared his throat softly. Garrick, why don't we discuss the freight schedule? We've been out here long enough. He smiled at Lenora. This is an interesting project, Lenora. Perhaps something for the right season. It is the right season, Lenora said. Her voice was level. I have a plan, I have the space, and I have a craftsman who can help me execute it. Preston looked at Silas with that same assessing look from the first morning. He let his eyes rest there a moment too long, and then he looked back at Lenora with the patient expression of a man who has decided not to argue this particular point right now. Of course, he said. Garrick, the freight schedule? Garrick looked at Lenora. Something moved in his expression, not cruelty, but the complicated heaviness of a father who loves his daughter and has decided he knows better. We'll talk tonight, he said. And then they walked away, both of them, back toward the house, and the conversation was over. Lenora stood in the doorway of the carriage house and watched them go. Silas stood beside her. He didn't say anything because there was nothing useful to say, and he'd learned years ago that there was a particular kind of bad feeling that didn't want words, it wanted to be acknowledged, and then allowed to stand on its own for a minute before anyone tried to fix it. After a while, Lenora said, He's going to tell me tonight that the workshop isn't practical. That's Preston's word. Practical. Probably. And then he's going to tell me that Preston has offered some arrangement for the freight partnership. Something that makes business sense. She paused. and he's going to suggest that my feelings about it are worth considering, but shouldn't be the deciding factor. How do you know? That's what he'll say. Because that's what he said the last 2 times. She turned and went back into the carriage house. She picked up her notebook and looked at her drawings of the layout. I'm not going to fight about it tonight. That never works. What are you going to do? She looked at him. Her eyes were steady and a little tired and completely clear. I'm going to build something. That's what I said this morning. I meant it. Silas looked at the back wall with its checked studs and its good bones. I can start on the framing in 2 days, after I finish the hallway trim. That stays on the original commission list, so your father can't object to the timing. She looked at him for a moment. You don't have to do that. I know I don't have to. My father could extend your contract or end it early. Preston would push for the second one if he decided you were in the way. I noticed that, and you're still saying 2 days. He looked at the wall. The framing needs to be done right or the shelving won't hold. That's got nothing to do with anything else. She was quiet. He could feel her looking at the side of his face with that reading the wood quality she had, the careful patience. He didn't look back. He measured the wall with his eyes and counted studs and calculated lumber and let her look as long as she wanted. 2 days, she said finally. 2 days. That night, Preston found Silas at the edge of the yard, where Silas had gone after supper to check on the lumber he'd stacked earlier, making sure the cover was secured against the weather. Preston came around the corner of the barn with his jacket on against the evening cold, and his hands in his pockets and the walk of a man who had decided something. He stopped a few feet away and looked at Silas for a moment without performing the pleasantry of a greeting. I want to make something clear, Preston said, because I think you're a sharp enough man to appreciate directness. Silas waited. Preston reached into his jacket and removed a folded envelope. He held it out. It was thick, the thickness of serious money, the kind that took some time to count. Every dollar you'd earn in 3 months here, Preston said, for finishing what you've started on the indoor work, leaving the carriage house untouched, and heading out of Red Willow before the week is out. Silas looked at the envelope. He thought about the back wall of the carriage house, the checklists, the way the east light came through those 2 windows in the morning. He thought about a layout drawn on brown paper and a woman who had added a showroom wall to his sketch. No, he said. Preston kept the envelope extended for a moment, as if Silas might change his mind given time. Then he lowered it. 6 months' earnings, Preston said. His voice was still even, but something under it had shifted. Walk away tonight. No, that's a significant sum for a traveling carpenter. I know what it is. Preston looked at him with those quick cataloging eyes, and for the first time since he'd arrived, the polished surface slipped just enough to show what was underneath. It wasn't rage. It was colder than rage, the flat recognition of a man who had run a calculation and found a variable he hadn't accounted for. You understand, Preston said carefully, that your presence here creates a problem. Not for me, for Lenora. A woman in her position, spending her days with a tradesman, giving people in this town cause to wonder that does her no service. Then it's her decision to make. Her father would disagree. Her father, Silas said, isn't the one she's building something for? Preston was quiet for a moment. The evening wind moved through the yard. Somewhere in the stable, a horse shifted. Put the envelope away, Silas said, and don't bring it out again. Preston looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then he put the envelope back in his jacket pocket. His face was composed again, the surface restored, but the calculation behind his eyes was running now, running fast, reworking something into a new shape. Good evening, Corbett, he said, and walked back toward the house. Silas stood in the yard alone for a while after that. He knew what had just happened. Not just the offer was simple, that was only money. What had happened was that Preston Vale had assessed him as a problem that money could solve, and had discovered that it couldn't, and had now reclassified the problem into a different category. And men like Preston Vale, when they reclassified a problem, generally moved to a solution that required less courtesy. Silas covered the lumber against the weather. He checked the tarp twice. He walked back toward the bunkhouse and stopped at the edge of the yard and looked at the house and at the second-floor window where the light was still on, the same as last night. He should leave. He knew the shape of the situation clearly enough. He'd seen the version of this story before, not exactly this version, but the bones of it. Wandering man, settled house, someone else's claim on the woman, someone else's money and influence and leverage. He knew how those stories usually ended, and it wasn't with the man who had a tool chest and no permanent address. He knew he should leave. He also knew he wasn't going to. He went inside and lay down on his bunk and looked at the ceiling in the dark. And he thought about what he'd said to Preston. Her father isn't the one she's building something for, and realized he'd meant it as a statement about Lenora and her workshop. And that was true. But it was also true in another way that he hadn't fully admitted to himself until the words were already out of his mouth. He lay there with that for a while. Then he closed his eyes. Because there was work in the morning, and Silas Corbett, whatever else he was, always showed up for the work. The hallway trim took a day and a half, which was half a day longer than Silas had estimated, because he found rot in the baseboard on the north-facing wall that nobody had mentioned, and that would have become a serious problem within another winter if left alone. He pulled it, replaced the damaged section, and refitted the trim without saying anything about it to anyone. Garrick would see it on the final accounting, or he wouldn't. Either way, the wall was sound now, and that was the point. He started on the carriage house back wall the following morning. Preston watched him carry lumber across the yard from the main house porch. Silas could feel the watching without looking up. It had a particular quality, not the idle observation of a man with nothing to do, but the focused attention of a man tracking a development he hadn't fully decided how to respond to yet. Silas stacked his lumber inside the carriage house door and went back for the second load and didn't return the attention. Lenora came out mid-morning with coffee and something else, a folded piece of paper that she set on the workbench without comment. He picked it up between cuts. It was a list of potential clients she'd drafted, ranches and merchants in the territory she thought might commission furniture if they knew someone competent was available. She'd written notes beside each name what they'd need, what their budgets likely were, whether she'd spoken to any of them already. 3 of the names had small check marks beside them. She'd already made inquiries. He set the paper down and went back to work, and he was smiling in a way he didn't particularly try to stop. Garrick came to the carriage house that afternoon. He stood in the doorway for a moment, hands in his coat pockets, watching Silas' sister a new stud alongside a checked one. The sound of hammering filled the space and then stopped. "You started in here," Garrick said. "Hallway trim is done." This was next on the extended list. Garrick looked at the back wall, at the new lumber bright against the old framing. He had the look of a man building an argument, not to use immediately, but to have ready. "Lenora asked you to start this particular item. She asked me to assess it. I assessed it. It needed doing, Corbett." Garrick's voice dropped into a different register, not threatening, but heavy with the particular weight of a man who was used to being the final word on everything within his sightlines. "I'm going to speak plainly. I appreciate plain. You're a skilled man. I've got no complaint about your work." He paused. "But you've been here long enough that I need to say something clearly. Preston Vale is an important business relationship. Not just to me, to the future of this freight operation and to Lenora's security. You understand what I mean?" "I understand what you're saying." "Then you understand that anything that complicates that relationship isn't something I can allow. Including," he stopped, looked at the wall, "including a tradesman who gives my daughter ideas about workshops and commissions and independent ventures when what she actually needs is—" "What does she actually need?" Silas asked. He asked it quietly, not aggressively. He genuinely wanted to hear the answer. Garrick looked at him. "Stability, a proper establishment. She's running this household. She managed your business correspondence while you were in Denver. Dawson told me that. Caught a structural problem in her own room that your last contractor missed and left for 8 years. She designed a workshop layout that accounts for load-bearing capacity and natural light." Silas paused. "I don't think stability is what she's missing." Garrick's jaw tightened. "It's not your assessment to make." "No, it's not." Silas picked up his hammer. "You asked me to speak plain." "I did. I'll get back to work now." Garrick stood in the doorway for another moment. He wasn't a man who stormed off. He was too controlled for that. He simply looked at Silas with the expression of someone recalculating a figure that had come out differently than expected, and then he turned and walked back toward the house. Silas drove a nail and felt his heartbeat in his ears. He hadn't meant to say all of that. He'd meant to say some of it. The rest had come out on its own, the way a board sometimes splits along a grain line you hadn't seen, not because you did something wrong, but because the pressure had been building in that direction for a while. He thought about the envelope in Preston's jacket pocket. He thought about the client list on the workbench with 3 check marks on it. He thought about what Garrick had just said what she actually needs, and the particular confidence of a man who had decided that question had a known answer, and he was the one who knew it. He kept working. The studs went in straight and solid, which was more than he could say for most of what was happening around them. That evening, the atmosphere in the house changed in a way that was hard to locate precisely but impossible to miss. Supper was quieter. Garrick spoke mostly to Preston about freight routes and timing, and a contract with a mining operation north of Denver that sounded large and complicated. Preston listened and responded and asked the right questions, and the two of them worked through the meal in the easy rhythm of men who had found their mutually useful frequency. Lenora sat across the table and ate and spoke when spoken to and gave nothing away. She was wearing the composed face, the one where the eyes did their own private work behind a neutral surface. Silas watched her for a moment, across the table, and she looked back at him briefly, and in that brief look there was something that wasn't quite worry and wasn't quite resolve, but was something between the two. After supper, Silas was cleaning his tools in the workshop alcove when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned expecting Dawson. It was Lenora. She came in and closed the door behind her, which was unusual. She stood with her back against it for a moment. "My father spoke to you this afternoon," she said. "He did. What did he say?" Silas considered the question. "He said Preston Vale is important to the freight business and that he can't allow complications." "Did he say I was the complication or you were?" "He was diplomatic about it." Lenora made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. She came and sat on the overturned crate she'd used before, the one she'd worn a shallow groove into from sitting on it so many times over the past weeks. She sat with her elbows on her knees and her hands folded and looked at the floor for a moment. "He sat me down tonight before supper," she said, "told me that Preston has formally asked his permission to court me, and that he's given it." Silas was quiet. "He didn't ask me," she said. "He told me. He said it's the right decision for the family, and that he'd given Preston permission, and that he expected me to receive the courtship respectfully." She paused. "He used the word respectfully twice. What did you say?" "Think about it." She looked up. "Which isn't the same as yes, but my father heard it as a yes. Or decided to hear it as one. What does Preston think?" "Preston thinks it's already settled." Her voice was flat with a specific kind of anger, not hot but cold and very clear. The anger of a person who has been discussed in the third person by people who thought they had the authority to make her decision. "He congratulated me at supper. Did you see? When my father stepped out to speak to Dawson. Preston looked at me across the table and said, 'I think this is going to work out well for everyone, Lenora.' Like it was a freight contract he'd just finalized." Silas set down the tool he was holding, and then she said, "He looked at you. I know. He's going to move against you. I don't know how yet, but he's going to find a way to have you removed from the property. He already tried the direct approach." Lenora looked at him. "The envelope. You knew about that?" "I suspected. He was out in the yard with you that night, and he wasn't out there to look at the stars." She studied him. "You said no." I said no. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was different, lower, and the composure had cracked just enough to let something real through. "Silas, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. My father can make things difficult for you in this territory. Preston has connections in Denver that Lenora." He looked at her directly. "I know what the situation is. I knew it when I said no to the envelope. I'm not asking you to protect me from the consequences of my own decisions." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why did you say no?" He'd been waiting for that question, or something like it, for the past 2 days. He'd been working on his answer without meaning to. The way you work on a joint without consciously deciding to just turning it over, fitting it, checking it. He thought he had a version of it that was honest, without being more than the situation called for. "Because the envelope was asking me to say that something didn't matter when it did," he said. "And I've spent a long time in my life packing my tools and moving on. I'm good at it. But there's a difference between leaving because it's right and leaving because someone paid you to pretend it was right." Lenora looked at her hands. Something in her face was working through something. The workshop, she said. If you're asked to stop if my father terminates the commission, then I'll finish what I've started on the carriage house framing before I go. You can find someone to complete the shelving from a plan. I'll draw the plan. That's not what I was going to say. What were you going to say? She looked up. Her eyes were steady and a little bright and absolutely direct. I was going to say that the workshop matters because it's the only thing I have that's actually mine. Not the house that's my father's. Not the furniture in it that was my mother's. Not the freight business that's always been my father's. The workshop is the only thing that would exist because I decided it would. She stopped. And you're the only person who understood that without me having to explain it 4 times. And I don't... She stopped again. I don't know what to do with that. Silas looked at her. He thought about 17 towns and 17 finished jobs, and the particular discipline he'd built over 9 years of never letting anything become a reason to stay. He thought about the way he'd described it to himself, freedom, movement, the traveling craftsman's life, and whether it had ever actually felt like freedom or whether it had just felt like the absence of the kind of risk that was sitting in this room right now, in the form of a woman on an overturned crate with her hands folded and her composure cracked and her eyes asking him something she hadn't put into words yet. You don't have to do anything with it, he said. Not tonight. She looked at him for another moment. Then she nodded. Once. And stood up and straightened her dress and was composed again, or composed enough. Get some sleep, she said. The framing needs to be done before Preston figures out how to stop it. She left. The door closed behind her. Silas stood in the quiet for a moment and then went back to cleaning his tools, and his hands moved through the familiar motions without him having to think about them, which was useful because he was thinking about other things entirely. 3 days later, Preston made his move. It wasn't the direct kind. Silas should have expected that direct had already failed, and Preston was not a man who repeated a failed approach. He went sideways instead. He went into town. Silas found out from Dawson, who'd heard it from the feed store owner's wife, who'd heard it from 2 different sources in the same afternoon, which was the speed at which news traveled in Red Willow when someone with money wanted it to travel. What Preston had said, in the quiet conversational way of a man who wasn't spreading a rumor but simply sharing a concern, was that the Holloway Ranch had hired a craftsman who had arrived without references, who had a pattern of moving from town to town without establishing himself anywhere, and who had been spending considerable time in close company with Miss Holloway in ways that might be worth keeping in mind. He hadn't said anything false. Exactly. That was the thing about it. He'd said true things in a configuration that meant something untrue, and he'd done it in enough places that by the time Silas rode into town for supplies 2 days later, he could feel the difference in the way people looked at him. The feed store owner was shorter than his usual conversation. The woman at the dry goods counter served him without making eye contact. 2 men he'd spoken to pleasantly a week ago nodded without stopping. None of it was overt. It was all in the surface layer, the particular texture of a small community that had heard something and was waiting to see how it settled. He bought his supplies and rode back to the ranch and put the horse up without saying anything to anyone. He went to the carriage house and picked up his hammer and worked until the light failed. Lenora came to find him just before dark. You went to town, she said. Needed lumber for the shelving brackets. And he looked at her. You've heard. Dawson told me what he heard, which was what Preston said, or a version of it. She leaned against the door frame. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. You didn't do it. It's being done because of me. Being done because Preston decided to do it. He set the hammer down. The lumber came out of the Henderson mill, not the Crane mill. Henderson was the same as always. Not everyone. She looked at him. It'll get worse. Probably. You could still Lenora. Stopped. I know what you're going to say. I've already decided. He looked at the back wall with its new framing, solid and straight, and ready for the shelving load. Brackets go in tomorrow. Another 2 days on the shelving itself. Then we look at the south window header. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind had picked up a front, pushing down from the north, the kind of cold that announced itself before it arrived. She pulled her shawl tighter. My father is planning a dinner, she said. Saturday. For Preston, some of his freight contacts, and 2 men from Denver that Preston is bringing. He wants me to be, she paused for the right word, presentable, as opposed to what you usually are, as opposed to present without performing it. Something in her voice was tired. Not the tired of lack of sleep, but the tired of managing a thing for a long time. He wants me to be Garrick Holloway's marriageable daughter in front of men who can make Preston's railroad connections more solid. I'm a detail in the business arrangement. Silas looked at her. She wasn't asking for his sympathy. She was telling him a fact, the way she always told him facts directly, without decoration, because she'd learned that decorated facts didn't stay facts very long. What are you going to do? Go to the dinner, she said. Be there, not be what they're expecting. She pushed off the doorframe. The same thing I always do. She left, and Silas stood in the darkening carriage house and listened to the wind picking up outside and thought about the dinner on Saturday and what it would mean and what it wouldn't mean. And then he picked up his tools and began to pack them for the night, with the careful attention of a man who was giving his hand something to do, so his mind could work. The dinner came. Silas was not invited, which he had not expected to be. But he was present in the bunkhouse, 20 yards from the main house, close enough to hear voices from the dining room windows when the wind was right. He sat on his bunk and sharpened his chisels and didn't listen, or tried not to. He heard Garrick laugh twice. He heard Preston's measured tones moving through what were clearly prepared points about railroad expansion and freight opportunity. He heard other voices he didn't know. He didn't hear Lenora, and that was the one he was listening for whether he meant to or not. At 9 o'clock, Dawson came to the bunkhouse looking for a corkscrew, of all things, and while he was rooting through the supplies cabinet, he said without looking up, Miss Lenora's holding her own in there. One of Preston's Denver men made a comment about the freight manifest, and she corrected him on a cargo figure, quietly. He turned red. Dawson found the corkscrew and straightened up. Preston didn't look happy about it. What did her father do? Changed the subject. Dawson looked at the corkscrew. He changed it fast. He left. Silas went back to his chisels. At 10:30, after the horses had come for the Denver guests, and the house had gone quiet, he heard footsteps crossing the yard. Light, quick. He knew whose they were before the door opened. Lenora came in. She was still in her dinner dress, which was dark green and considerably more formal than anything he'd seen her in before, and she looked both entirely herself and entirely out of place in the bunkhouse doorway. He offered Preston a 40% stake in Holloway Freight, she said. That was the real business of the evening. The courtship is the arrangement that makes the stake transfer look like family rather than acquisition. Silas set down the chisel. Preston brought contracts, she continued. Drafted in Denver. My father signed 2 of them tonight. Third, she stopped. The third includes a clause about Holloway family assets, of which I am apparently one. He signed contracts about you, not specifically about me, but structured so that if I marry Preston, the stake increases to 60%. If I don't, she paused. If I don't, there's a clause that allows Preston to call in a loan he apparently extended to my father's freight operation 6 months ago. A private loan. My father never mentioned it to me. Cold settled into the room in a different way than the weather. How much? Silas asked. Enough that my father couldn't repay it without selling the northern freight routes, which would effectively end the Denver operation. She looked at him steadily. Preston has had this arranged for months. The courtship, the dinner, the Denver men, all of it was dressing on a business structure he built before he set foot on this property. Silas was quiet for a moment. He thought about the envelope in Preston's jacket pocket. He thought about the way Preston had looked at him from the porch while he carried lumber. He thought about a man who came to a ranch with contracts already drafted in his bag. Your father knows what the loan clause means, Silas said.
Yes.
And he thinks if the marriage goes well, the clause never matters. He thinks he can manage Preston once the partnership is established. She looked at the floor for a moment. He's wrong. Men like Preston don't let you manage them after they've given you a reason to need them. Have you told your father that? I told him some of it tonight, after the guests left. She paused. He said I was looking for reasons to refuse what was good for the family. He said it was time to be realistic. Her jaw tightened. He said it gently. That's the worst part. He meant it kindly. Silas looked at her, standing there in her dinner dress in the bunkhouse, with the cold coming through the door she'd left slightly open. And he thought about Garrick Holloway, who was not a bad man, who had spent his life building something real, and was now about to hand a significant piece of it to a man who had engineered the transaction from the start. He thought about what it cost to see that clearly and not be able to make the person you loved see it. "Come look at the framing," he said. She blinked. "What?" "Carriage house. Come look at what got done today." She looked at him for a moment, uncertain, and then something shifted in her expression, and she said, "All right." And he picked up the lamp from the hook by the door, and they walked across the dark yard to the carriage house together. Inside, the new framing was complete. Every stud sister, solid, the whole back wall, ready to take whatever weight she wanted to put on it. He held the lamp up and let the light move across the work. Lenora looked at it in silence. She walked along the wall and pressed her hand against one of the new studs, testing it the way she'd sighted down the oak board on the first morning, not for show, but because she actually wanted to know. "It's Olidson," she said. "It'll hold anything you want to put on it." She stood with her hand flat against the new framing for a moment. Then she turned and looked at the space, the whole carriage house, the east windows dark now but existing, the floor she'd been planning to lay boards over, the south wall where the new window header would go in next week. "Going to be real," she said. Not to him, exactly. More like confirming it for herself. It's already real. It's a wall. Walls are about as real as things get. She almost laughed. Almost. Then the wind outside changed pitch, rising sharply, and somewhere across the yard something clattered, a shutter, a loose board, and Silas held the lamp up and looked at the carriage house door and felt the air pressure in the room shift in the way he'd learned over years of working in buildings to interpret as a weather change that was not gradual. "Wind's picking up bad," he said. "It does this in October. It'll pass by." Then they both smelled it, not wood smoke from the house chimney that was familiar, expected. This was different, heavier, the specific thick smell of something burning that was not supposed to burn. Silas was out the carriage house door before the word had fully formed in his mind, and he saw it immediately. The freight warehouse, 60 yards east of the main house, had orange light in the upper windows where no light should have been. He turned back to the carriage house door. "Lenora, warehouse is on fire. Wake the house." She didn't freeze and she didn't ask questions. She ran. Silas ran toward the warehouse. He could hear it before he reached it, the particular creak and pop of dry timber taking heat, the sound that experienced builders knew as a clock running down. The main doors were closed. He pulled them open and got a face full of smoke and heat and saw immediately what he was dealing with. 3 overturned lanterns on the floor near the south wall. The wind had come through a gap in the siding and knocked the lanterns over, and the dry wood had caught fast. Fire was already running up the south wall and beginning to reach the ceiling joists. More than that, at the back of the warehouse, stacked freight formed a wall that had collapsed partially, and 2 workers who had been doing late inventory work were on the wrong side of the collapse. He could hear them shouting. Men came running from the bunkhouse and the house. Dawson. 3 hands, and then Garrick in his coat, and behind him Preston with his jacket on and his face sharp with alarm that was rapidly calculating cost before the fire was even assessed. Preston pushed to the front and looked at the warehouse. "The ledger room," he said. "The company books, the draft contracts, someone get to the minutes." "There are 2 men behind that freight collapse," Silas said. "Contracts are worth more than—" Preston stopped himself, looked at the door. "The roof could come down any moment. No one goes in there. I'm going in there." Silas was already looking at the structural situation. The fire was worst on the south wall. The ceiling joists above the south section were beginning to show char. The north section was still clear, but the freight collapse was blocking the workers' exit through the main door. "Dawson, get the 2 draft horses from the stable and every rope you can find." Now Dawson went. Preston caught Silas's arm. "I'm telling you, the roof." Silas removed his arm from Preston's grip without ceremony. He looked at Garrick. "That south wall is going to fail first. When it goes, it'll take the southwest corner of the roof. But the north wall is clear, and the main beam is still sound. If we pull down the east section before the south wall fails, we create a break the fire can't cross open ground." Garrick looked at the warehouse. He wasn't a man who panicked, and he wasn't a man who froze. He looked at the building with the eyes of someone who understood structures, who had built things, who could read what Silas was reading. "You'd destroy the east section," Garrick said. "I'd lose maybe 30% of the warehouse. Instead of all of it, and the 2 men inside. The freight is replaceable." Silas looked at him. "Those 2 men are not." Garrick looked at the fire for exactly 2 seconds. "Then what do you need?" Silas told him. What happened next was not clean or organized or efficient in the way that stories sometimes make emergencies sound. It was loud and hot, and there were moments where the plan almost failed entirely. The first rope throw missed the roof beam, and the smoke drove 2 of the hands back before they'd completed the anchor point on the north side. And Dawson's horse spooked at the fire sound and had to be brought back. One of the draft horses refused to move until Garrick himself took the lead line and walked them forward. Silas went inside through the north door with a wet cloth over his face and found the 2 workers, both young men, both scared, both on their feet, which was the important thing. The freight collapse was manageable if you knew where to push. He did. He moved 3 large crates by brute force and got the first worker through, and then went back for the second. He came out coughing so hard he bent double at the waist, and Dawson hauled him back by the collar. And then the ropes were set, and the horses were pulling, and the east section of the warehouse wall came down with a sound that seemed to go on longer than physics, should allow a long tearing groan, and then a crash that sent sparks spinning into. The dark sky and the fire hesitated, actually hesitated, burning itself toward the new gap instead of spreading outward. The break held. The south wall failed 12 minutes later, exactly as Silas had said it would, taking the southwest corner of the roof with it in a controlled collapse rather than a spreading one. The north section of the warehouse stood. The fire burned itself down into the wreckage of what had already fallen, and by midnight the hands had it contained. 2 workers were unhurt. Shaken, smoke-stung, one of them had a cut on his arm from the freight, but both standing. Garrick stood in the yard, looking at what remained of his warehouse, with his coat open, and his face showing something that Silas had not seen on him before, the raw expression of a man who had come close to something he couldn't fix. He stood there and looked at it for a while. Then he started walking through the salvaged papers and equipment that his men had pulled from the building during the controlled effort. He opened crates. He went through the materials that had been near the freight collapse. He found several document boxes that had been in the north section and opened them, looking for the company papers he'd been tracking. What he found instead, in a water-stained leather case that had been stored with the freight records, were documents he hadn't known were there. He stood very still for a long time, reading. Silas, sitting on the water trough with a wet cloth over his face, watched Garrick go still from across the yard. He watched the older man read and reread whatever he was holding. And he watched Garrick's face move through something that had several stages, starting with confusion and ending somewhere much colder. Preston had come to stand at the edge of the yard, looking at the warehouse, calculating. He'd been calculating since the fire started. Silas had watched it happen in real time. The way Preston's eyes moved between the damage and Garrick and the salvaged materials, always adding and subtracting. He wasn't calculating now. He was watching Garrick read. Garrick looked up from the documents and looked at Preston across the firelit yard. The expression on his face was one Silas had not seen before, and hoped not to see again, the particular look of a man who has just understood the full shape of something he thought he already knew. "Preston," Garrick said. The single word in that tone carried across the yard, and the noise and the dying fire, the way a voice carries when it has weight behind it. Preston stood very still. Garrick held up the documents. "Come here and explain these to me." Preston looked at the papers in Garrick's hands. Something behind his eyes ran a very fast calculation. Then his face composed itself into the expression. Silas had seen it return to a dozen times the managed surface, smooth and controlled. He started to walk toward Garrick, and whatever he was planning to say, Silas could see him building it as he walked, word by careful word. The documents in Garrick's hands were not complicated to understand once you knew what you were looking at. That was the thing about a careful scheme. It had to be legible enough for the person running it to track, which meant it was legible enough for anyone else who got close enough to read it. What Garrick had found was a set of internal letters between Preston and two of his Denver associates, stored in the freight case along with copies of the loan documents Lenora had described. The letters were businesslike and specific. They outlined a timeline. They referred to Garrick Holloway by name and to the Holloway freight operation by its annual revenue figure, which Preston had apparently obtained from somewhere he hadn't been given permission to obtain it from. They discussed the loan as a mechanism rather than a gesture of goodwill. One letter used the phrase controlled acquisition with the matter-of-fact tone of a man writing a grocery list. Preston walked across the yard and stood in front of Garrick and looked at the documents, and then looked at Garrick and said, "Those are internal correspondence. They were stored in confidence. In my warehouse," Garrick said. "In a case I brought to the property. My private papers. Stored in my freight building. Found by my men during a fire on my property." Garrick's voice was not loud. That was the telling thing. Garrick was a man who got louder when he was angry in the ordinary way, the frustration of a blocked deal or a broken piece of equipment. This was a different register entirely. He was quiet the way cold water is quiet. Controlled acquisition. Preston's expression held. He was good at holding it. "That's a phrase taken out of. It has a date," Garrick said. 4 months ago. Before you came to Red Willow the first time. Before you introduced yourself to me as a potential partner." He looked at the letter again. "You built the loan structure before we'd had 3 conversations. You decided on the marriage arrangement before you'd met Lenora. Business and personal matters developed together. That's not. You told me the loan was a gesture of good faith between partners." Garrick's jaw was working. I remember those exact words, good faith. Preston was quiet. "Get off my property," Garrick said. It was 4 words, said at the same volume as everything else, and they landed with more weight than a shout would have. Preston looked at him for a moment. His composure was intact. Technically, the surface held, but underneath it, Silas could see the rapid adjustment happening. The pivot to whatever came next. The search for a position that still had leverage. "The loan is a legal instrument, Garrick. Your feelings about how it was structured don't. I'll have my lawyer in Denver review it by end of week," Garrick said. "I suspect he'll have questions about the disclosure obligations, about what you told me and what you didn't." He paused. "Get off my property tonight. Don't come back." Preston looked at the papers one more time. Then he looked past Garrick at the burned warehouse, at the hands gathered in the yard, at Silas sitting on the water trough. He looked at Silas for a moment with an expression that had nothing managed about it, just the flat acknowledgement of a man who had run a sophisticated operation and had not accounted for one variable that shouldn't have mattered. Then he turned and walked to the house, and 20 minutes later rode out of the yard with his bags, and the sound of his horse faded down the approach road and was gone. The yard was quiet, except for the settling sound of the burned warehouse cooling in the night air. Garrick stood where he was for a long moment, holding the papers at his side. The hands drifted back to their work, checking the fire containment, securing the salvaged materials, tending to the 2 workers who had been pulled from behind the freight collapse. The ordinary aftermath of a disaster, which always looked like a lot of people doing practical things and nobody quite looking at each other. Lenora came and stood beside her father. She didn't say anything. She stood close enough that their arms were almost touching, and she looked at the warehouse the way he was looking at it, not with grief, exactly, but with the particular assessment of people who care about structures and are calculating what can be saved. After a while, Garrick said, "You knew about Preston." "I suspected. I didn't know about the letters. You told me twice." "Yes." He was quiet for another moment. "I didn't hear it," he said. It was not an excuse. It was stated the way a man states a fact he finds uncomfortable plainly, without softening, because he'd decided the discomfort was appropriate. Lenora looked at him. "I know you didn't. He stopped. Started again. "I was afraid. The loan, the railroad connections, the freight routes north. I thought if I could lock it in, if the partnership was solid, I could stop worrying about what happens to all of this after I'm gone." He looked at the burned building. "I wanted it secured. I wanted you secured." "I don't want to be secured," Lenora said. "I want to help build it." Garrick looked at his daughter. His face was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "I know," he said, quietly. "I'm beginning to understand that." He went inside after that. The yard gradually emptied. Silas finished sitting on the water trough when his legs told him they'd had enough resting, and he stood and checked the fire containment, one more time force of habit, craftsman's instinct for verifying before walking away, and then he turned toward the bunkhouse. Lenora was waiting by the carriage house door, not dramatically just standing there, like she'd happened to stop there on the way to somewhere else. The two men who were inside, she said when he reached her. Both fine. Tom Rayleigh cut his arm on the crate edge. Dawson's wrapped it. She nodded. She looked at the warehouse. How did you know that pulling the east wall would create a break? Fires don't cross open ground. If there's nothing to burn, they stop. He looked at the burned section. I've worked in enough structures to know where they fail first. The south wall was going no matter what. The question was whether the failure was going to be controlled or not. You controlled it. We controlled it. Your father walked those horses himself. She glanced at him. He did. He's not a coward. He made a bad calculation about Preston. That's different. Lenora looked at the carriage house door. The framing inside, it's all right. The fire didn't reach it. It's fine. The fire never got this far. He paused. The east window is going to need the sill cleaned. Smoke got in. That's an hour's work. Not a problem. She let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite relief, but was somewhere between them. An hour's work. Not a problem. Not a problem. She looked at him for a moment. The yard was quiet around them, the fire smell hanging in the cold air, the stars sharp and numerous above the open Colorado dark. She looked at him with the same quality of attention she'd used from the beginning patient, reading, not rushing toward a conclusion. Get some sleep, she said. There's a lot to assess in the morning. He went to the bunkhouse. He lay down. He thought he wouldn't sleep easily, and he was right. He lay on his back for a while, looking at the ceiling, with the fire smell still in his nose, and the sequence of events running through his mind like a plan being checked for errors. The rope that missed the first time. The horse that spooked. The moment when the east wall came down, and he hadn't known yet whether the break would hold. There were about 4 places where it could have gone differently. He was very aware of that. He fell asleep eventually, and slept hard and woke before the hands, and lay there in the gray early light, listening to the ranch come awake around him. The next week moved in a different rhythm than the weeks before it. Garrick spent 3 days in correspondence letters to his Denver lawyer, letters to the freight contacts Preston had brought to the dinner, letters to the 2 men from the mining operation to the north. He did it methodically, without dramatics. He was a man cleaning up a mess he'd made, and he treated it with the same matter-of-fact practicality he'd have applied to any other practical problem. 2 of the freight contacts wrote back within the week. The mining contract was not lost. Preston's involvement had not yet formalized those arrangements, and without him at the table, the direct negotiation reopened. The Denver lawyer confirmed that the loan structure had disclosure problems that made its enforcement legally complicated at best. The hold Preston had engineered over 6 careful months dissolved in about 10 days, which was the thing about leverage built on misdirection. It required the other person's ignorance to function. Once Garrick knew the shape of it, it stopped working. But the warehouse still had a burned south section and a missing east wall, and the freight operation had been disrupted enough that Garrick needed to think clearly about what came next. He did that, thinking out loud at the supper table more than once, which was different from how he'd operated before. Silas had noticed, Garrick made his decisions privately and announced them as conclusions. Now he laid out the problem and listened to what came back. Lenora always had something to say. Garrick listened more than he had before. Silas stayed out of those conversations. They weren't his. He ate his meals and went back to work, because there was still significant work to do. The warehouse would need assessment before any reconstruction. The carriage house shelving was ready to start. The south window header was cut and waiting to be set. Garrick came to find him in the carriage house on the 4th morning after the fire. Silas was setting the first shelving brackets into the new studs, working alone in the early light. He heard Garrick's step in the doorway and kept working until he'd finished the bolt he was setting. Then he looked up. Garrick stood just inside the door. He looked around the carriage house, the new framing on the back wall, the east windows, the floor that Silas and Lenora had discussed laying boards over. He looked at it the way he'd looked at the finished bed, with a genuine evaluation The eye of a man who understood the difference between work that was merely completed and work that was done right. Good framing, he said. It'll hold. Garrick nodded. He put his hands in his coat pockets. I owe you something, he said. Beyond the commission, you don't owe me anything beyond the commission. 2 of my men are standing because of what you did. The north section of that warehouse is standing. He paused. And you were right about Lenora. Silas set down his wrench. He looked at Garrick steadily. I said things to you, Garrick continued, about your place here, about complications. I was wrong in how I said them. I wasn't wrong that I was worried about her. I'm always worried about her. That's not something that turns off just because she's grown and capable. He looked at his hands. But I was using that worry in service of my own plans and calling it her best interest. No, Silas said, it's not. Garrick looked at him. What are your intentions toward my daughter? It was asked directly, without the diplomatic wrapping that men of Garrick's generation often used around that particular question. He looked at Silas the way Silas had noticed Lenora looked at things straight at them. Silas was quiet for a moment. He thought about what an honest answer looked like. He'd been turning that question over in various forms for the past 3 weeks, and he had a version of an answer now not tidy, not perfectly resolved, but real. I don't know the full shape of it yet, he said. I know I'm not passing through anymore. I know that whatever she's building here, I want to be part of building it, not managing it, not deciding it for her, but contributing to it. He paused. I know I haven't had a conversation in 9 years that felt like the conversations I've had with her, and I'm not willing to pack my tools and pretend that doesn't matter. Garrick looked at him for a long time. He was reading him, the way people who knew buildings read structures, checking the load, assessing the quality. She has opinions, Garrick said. You've noticed. I've noticed. She'll spend your money on lumber before she spends it on a new dress. She'll argue with you about the placement of a window for 3 days and be right about it and expect you to admit it. She usually will be right about it. Something shifted in Garrick's face. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. Yes, she usually will be. He looked around the carriage house again. The workshop commission was hers. Lenora's idea, Lenora's plan, Lenora's arrangement. I put my name on the payment because that's how business worked in this house. He paused. That's changing. He extended his hand. Silas shook it. It was a different handshake than the first one, longer, with more actual weight in it. Finish the workshop, Garrick said. We'll talk about the warehouse reconstruction after. He left. Silas stood in the carriage house and looked at the wall he was building and felt something settle in his chest. Not resolution, exactly. More like the moment when a joint finally seats correctly after 3 attempts. Not dramatic, just right. He went back to the shelving brackets. Lenora didn't hear about the conversation with her father until that afternoon when Garrick mentioned it himself at dinner, not as a dramatic announcement, but as information, the way he was beginning to share things more directly. He said that he'd spoken to Corbett about the workshop, that it was Lenora's commission and would be treated that way going forward, and that he thought Silas Corbett was a man whose judgment he'd undervalued. Lenora listened to this without changing her expression. She looked at Silas across the table. He was looking at his plate. She looked back at her father. I'll need a separate account for the workshop income, she said. Not folded into the house accounts. Separate. Garrick paused for only a beat. All right. And the commissions I arrange go through my name. Not Holloway Freight. Not anyone else. All right, Garrick said again. He was working at something. Silas could see the habit of control meeting the decision to release it, which was the kind of internal work that didn't come easily to men who'd run things their own way for 30 years. He was doing it anyway. Thank you, Papa, Lenora said, quietly but straight, without ceremony. Garrick looked at his supper. Don't thank me. I should have listened in April. After dinner, Silas was covering the lumber in the yard against the weather when Lenora came out. She stood beside the lumber stack and watched him work for a moment. He told you some of that, she said. Some. What he said about the workshop commission.
Yes.
She was quiet for a moment. The evening was cold but clear, the sky darkening at the east edge and still pale orange in the west. I've been thinking, she said, about what you said to me that night in the bunkhouse, about the difference between leaving because it's right and leaving because someone paid you to pretend it was. I remember. I've been thinking about what it would take. She paused, picking her words carefully, which she did less often than most people. Usually she said what she meant directly. The care she was taking now was its own kind of signal. For someone who's spent 9 years building reasons to leave, to decide to build something that stays. He finished tying the tarp and stood up straight. He looked at her. That's a complicated question. Most honest questions are, she said. Which was what he'd said to her on that second morning, the first time she'd asked him something he wasn't ready to answer. She'd remembered. Of course she'd remembered. The workshop shelving will be done in 3 days, he said. The south window header goes in Friday, weather permitting. After that, the major structural work is complete. He looked at the carriage house. You could receive clients by end of the month. I know the timeline, she said. It's not what I asked. He looked at her. She was watching him with the patient readiness of a woman who had a question and intended to let it stand until it got an honest answer. He'd been building toward this for a while. He'd built it the way he built everything slowly, with attention to what would hold, checking the quality before committing to the joint. He had the answer. He'd had it for longer than he'd admitted, even to himself. A man who builds things for a living, he said, learns the difference between a piece of work that's done and one that's finished. Done means you've reached the end of the task. Finished means it's complete, nothing missing, nothing provisional, nothing that still needs resolving. He paused. Most of the jobs I've left, they were done. I've never built anything I'd call finished. Lenora looked at him. I think, he said, that I could finish something here. The wind moved through the yard. Somewhere in the stable, a horse shifted. The last of the western sky was going dark. That's the closest thing to a declaration I'm going to get tonight, isn't it? She said. Probably. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, it's enough. For tonight. She turned toward the house. Friday for the window header? Friday, she went inside. Silas stood in the cold yard for a moment, looking at the carriage house, at the main house, at the burned section of the warehouse that was already being assessed for what could be rebuilt. All of it needing work, all of it worth doing. He went to the bunkhouse and lay down and didn't lie awake for long. 3 days later, as he'd said, the shelving was done. It was good work. He knew it when he stood back and looked at it, not with pride exactly, which was always too loud a feeling for the kind of thing Silas cared about, but with the solid satisfaction of a craftsman who had taken a space with potential and given it its best function. The shelves ran along 3 walls of the carriage house interior, properly graded for load, with the display section on the back wall framed at the height Lenora had specified. The south window header had gone in on Friday, as promised, and the new window itself had been fitted on Saturday, and the morning light now moved through the carriage house in exactly the way Lenora's sketch had anticipated east windows bright in the morning for benchwork. South window throwing afternoon light across the display wall where finished pieces would stand. Lenora walked through it on the first morning it was complete. She moved slowly, touching the shelves, standing at the bench, sitting at the desk in the corner. She stood at the south window and looked out at the yard. She didn't say anything for a while. Silas stood at the door and let her have the space. Finally she turned. It's right, she said. It'll serve. Better than serve. She looked around. It's exactly what I drew. We drew some of it together. She looked at him. Something in her expression was open, in a way it wasn't usually, not vulnerable, not exposed, but genuinely visible. The composure was there, but it was the composure of someone who was choosing to let you see past it. We did, she said. He had been thinking about what he'd said in the yard finished, not just done. He'd been thinking about what it cost him to say that, and what it cost him not to say more, and what the next right step was for a man who was not accustomed to staying but had decided to try. I want to ask your father something, he said, before I ask you something.
Is that he stopped?
He wasn't sure what he was asking her permission for. Exactly. Whether the sequence was right, whether he had the sequence right. Lenora looked at him steadily. My father, she said carefully, doesn't decide what I say yes to. I know he doesn't. Then ask me first, she said. And then, if you want to, ask him, in that order. He looked at her. She was right. Of course she was right. He'd been going to do it the traditional way, the way that put the father in the middle of a question that was between 2 people, and she had recognized that and straightened it back out in about 8 seconds. He took a breath. I want to stay in Red Willow, he said. I want to finish the workshop with you, not as a contractor, but as a partner. I want to build the thing we've been drawing on brown paper and talking about for a month. And I want to do that alongside you, in every way that means. He paused. I'm asking you to marry me, not because it makes a sensible arrangement and not because your father has approved it. Because you're the first person I've met in 9 years who saw what I was actually doing when I worked, and not just what I was making. And I don't want to walk away from that. Lenora looked at him for a long moment. Not theatrically, not building to something. Just looking, the way she looked at everything, with her full attention and without hurrying it. What took you so long, she said. He almost laughed. He felt it come up from somewhere in his chest and had to press his mouth together. I was checking the quality of the joint, he said. She did smile then, the real one, the one that changed her face. And it'll hold. She crossed the workshop and stood in front of him. She was close enough that he could see the gray of her eyes, which in the new south window light had more warmth in them than gray usually had. Yes, she said, simply directly, no ceremony required. He reached out and took her hand. She let him. They stood in the new workshop, with the morning light coming through the east windows, and it was quiet and imperfect and exactly right. Garrick took the news that evening without surprise, which meant Lenora had either told him already or he'd been watching long enough to see it coming. He sat in the study with his hands on the desk and looked at Silas for a moment after Silas had spoken. I asked you once what your intentions were, Garrick said. You did. You said you didn't know the full shape of it yet. I know more of it now. Garrick was quiet. He looked at the desk, at a knot in the wood surface that Silas had noticed the first time he'd been in this room, a small imperfection in an otherwise solid piece. The kind of thing that didn't affect function, but was always visible. She'll run the business side of the workshop herself, Garrick said. You understand that. That's the only way it works. And she'll argue with you about design decisions. I'm counting on it. Garrick looked at him. She gets that from her mother, he said. The eye for it. The stubbornness about it. He paused. Her mother was usually right, too. He stood and extended his hand. Silas shook it. Don't leave, Garrick said. It was a plain statement, not a command, almost a request. I'm not leaving, Silas said. That night, after the house had gone quiet, Silas sat on the bunkhouse step for what he thought would probably be one of the last times. Colorado's sky was fully dark and enormous. The stars, the particular dense brightness that came when the air was cold and clean. He sat with his hands between his knees and looked up at it. He thought about 17 towns. He tried to count the rooms he'd built and all of them couldn't, which was fine. He thought about what the moving had felt like from the inside, whether it had ever felt the way he'd told himself it did. He thought about the first night he'd sat on this same step and watched Lenora's window stay lit longer than the others. He thought about the envelope Preston had held out in the yard. Every dollar you'd earn in 6 months. Walk away from Red Willow. He thought about the word no and how quickly it had come and what that quickness had meant. He'd known before he admitted it. That was the truth of it. He'd known when he drew the workshop layout on brown paper at midnight. He'd known when she'd found it on the bench and looked at him with that expression he hadn't had a category for. And he'd understood then that the lack of category was itself. The answer it was something he hadn't felt before, which was why it didn't fit anywhere he'd been. He stayed on the step a while longer, not because he needed to think anymore, but because the night was clear and cold and very still, and there was something he wanted to acknowledge in the quiet, not dramatically, not with words. Just a moment of sitting with the full weight of what had changed. Before he went inside, before the work of the next day started, before the thing he'd been building toward became simply the thing he lived. Then he went inside, and, for the first time since he'd arrived in Red Willow, the bunkhouse felt like a temporary arrangement, not in the old way, the way every place had felt temporary, like a problem waiting to resolve itself into departure. Temporary, because there was something better coming. He lay down on the bunk and closed his eyes, and he slept without lying awake first, which was the most honest measure he had of the state of a thing. The morning after Silas asked Lenora to marry him, he moved his tool chest out of the bunkhouse and into the carriage house workshop, which was not a romantic gesture, so much as a practical one. The bunkhouse was 30 yards from where he was working, and carrying tools back and forth twice a day in Colorado October was a waste of time. But when he set the chest against the north wall of the workshop and looked at it there, the dark wood against the new framing, something about it felt like a declaration more honest than anything he could have arranged on purpose. Lenora came in an hour later and saw it and didn't say anything. She moved her own work basket to the shelf directly above it, and that was that. They didn't announce the engagement dramatically. It spread through the ranch, the way things spread in small households. Dawson found out from something Garrick said at breakfast. And the two hands who'd been at Red Willow, Longitz found out from Dawson by mid-morning, and by dinner it was simply known. There was no party, no formal declaration, no moment where someone made a speech. Garrick raised his coffee cup at dinner and said, "To good work," and looked at both of them, and everyone at the table understood what he meant. Tom Rayleigh, whose arm was still wrapped from the cut he'd gotten in the warehouse fire, said, about time into his plate, and the table laughed. And that was the closest thing to a celebration they had that week. The real work came the next morning, and the morning after, and every morning following. Preston's legal situation resolved itself over the following 3 weeks without drama, which was somehow more satisfying than drama would have been. Garrick's Denver lawyer found 3 separate problems with the loan structure that made enforcement legally precarious, and sent Preston's attorney a letter that laid them out with the particular dry precision that lawyers use when they know they're right and want the other side to know it too. Preston countered through his own attorney, which was expected. What wasn't expected, or what Garrick hadn't quite anticipated, was that 2 of the freight contacts Preston had introduced, after learning the shape of what had happened, quietly reached out to Garrick directly to continue the conversations without Preston in the middle. The railroad connections Preston had dangled as leverage turned out to be accessible without him, which was the thing about a man who positions himself as indispensable. Sometimes he simply positioned himself, and the access was always real and always reachable, and he was just the hand that had been temporarily covering it. The loan was settled at a renegotiated figure, considerably lower than Preston had intended to call in, and Preston Vale left the Holloway freight orbit the way most things that had been overstated left quietly, with less impact than the fuss had suggested. Garrick told Silas and Lenora about it one evening after supper, briefly, and then turned to the warehouse reconstruction plans that Silas had drawn up, because that was the next real problem, and there was no reason to spend more time on the solved one. The warehouse plans were what occupied the 3 of them through the latter half of October. Silas had done a full structural assessment of what remained the north section was sound. The main beam had held. The east wall that he'd ordered pulled down had been the right call both for the fire and, it turned out, for the building's long-term layout, because the original east wall had been positioned poorly relative to the loading dock and had been creating workflow problems for years that nobody had named yet. The rebuild could fix it. Garrick walked the assessment with Silas 3 mornings in a row. He asked specific questions. He listened to the answers. He pushed back twice on material choices not wrongly. Both times he had a practical point about cost and timeline, and Silas adjusted the plan accordingly. Because Garrick's practical points were usually right in the way that 30 years of running a freight operation made them right. They didn't agree on everything. There was one afternoon where they stood on opposite sides of the loading question for 40 minutes, before finding a third option that neither had started with, and both of them recognized it as the better answer without making a production of the recognition. Lenora sat in on 2 of those sessions. She didn't speak much during them, but she watched the 2 men work through the problem together. And sometimes Silas would glance at her and see something in her expression that was not quite relief and not quite satisfaction, but was something in that territory the look of a person who had been holding 2 important things apart for a long time and was watching them begin to fit. The wedding was set for late November, which was faster than Garrick had expected, and about right by Lenora's calculation. She didn't want a long engagement. For the same reason she hadn't wanted a long courtship. She was not a woman who held things in provisional states longer than necessary. She knew what she'd decided. Provisional didn't serve anything. The ceremony happened in the main house, in the front room where the good furniture was. On a Saturday morning, when the first real snow of the season was coming down outside in the steady, purposeful way of Colorado November snow that meant business. Reverend Alcott from the Red Willow Church was invited to perform it, but Lenora had specified ahead of time that she wanted the ceremony short and civil in character, because she had always felt that the legal and personal substance of a marriage was the part that mattered, and the other embellishments were for an audience she didn't particularly feel she owed a performance. Reverend Alcott, who was a practical man and had known Lenora since she was 12, took this instruction without offense and delivered a ceremony that was direct and serious and 8 minutes long, which was exactly right. Garrick stood to one side, looking like a man holding something heavy that he was glad to be holding. Dawson and Tom Riley stood in the back. Two of the hands who'd been on the property longest stood near the door. The snow came down outside the window, steady and white. Silas stood in front of Lenora in his best clothes, which were not fancy but were clean and well-fitted, because he'd had them made by a tailor in the last large town he'd passed through, and had worn them only once before. Lenora was in a dress she'd had for 2 years dark blue, well-made, practical enough to be comfortable and formal enough to be appropriate, which was exactly the kind of balance she made look easy. She was not nervous. She had not been nervous all morning, which Silas had noticed because he had been, slightly not about the decision, but about the performance of it, the standing still while something important happened, which was harder for him than building. She had noticed his nerves and said, "At breakfast, it's 8 minutes. You've fit tenon joints that took longer." He had laughed, and the nerves had settled. Standing there in the front room with the snow outside and the small assembled household and Lenora's gray eyes on him, direct and present and entirely unceremonious, he said his piece and meant every word of it. She said hers in a clear voice without hesitation. Reverend Alcott concluded the legal language. Garrick let out a breath he'd apparently been holding. Dawson started to say something and Tom Riley elbowed him, which produced a sound that broke the formal silence and made everyone laugh. And that was the end of the ceremony and the beginning of the marriage, which felt about right. The wedding meal was held at the big table with the whole household, which is what Lenora had wanted, not a private dinner, not a formal event, but the ordinary table where the ordinary people who made the ranch function sat and ate together, with better food than usual, and Garrick producing a bottle of something good from the back of the study cabinet. The snow came down outside all afternoon. Nobody was in a hurry to be anywhere. Silas sat at the table and looked at the faces around it. Garrick, who was eating with the relaxed posture of a man who'd resolved something he'd been carrying. Dawson, who was telling a story that was getting longer with each telling. Tom Riley, who was on his second helping and following the story with a skeptical expression. Lenora beside him, eating and listening, and occasionally glancing at him with that particular quality of sideways attention that he'd been the subject of since the first morning. And he thought about 17 towns. And he thought about what any of those tables had felt like, and the comparison was not complicated. He was home, not in the sense of a building, in the sense of a quality of place, the specific gravity of somewhere that holds you, not because it traps you, but because it's worth staying for. Took him 9 years and 3 months to find it, which was longer than it should have been. And he was fairly sure the delay was almost entirely his own fault, and he was at peace with that. The first commission for Corbett Workshop, which was what Lenora was calling it. Initially, because the name question hadn't been settled yet, came in the second week of December, before the formal sign had even been made. A rancher named Colbert from 12 miles east had heard about the workshop from Dawson, of all people, who had apparently been talking about the shelving work in town with uncharacteristic enthusiasm. Colbert wanted a dining table, long, solid, oak or walnut, built to seat 12 because he had a large family and his current table was dying. Lenora handled the client meeting herself. She brought her notebook, asked the right questions about dimensions and use, and what the family actually did at the table versus what they imagined they did, and came back with notes that were specific and complete and showed she'd been listening to Colbert's actual problem, rather than the version of it he'd presented first. He said he wants walnut, she told Silas, but what he actually described is a table that needs to survive 4 children under the age of 10 and 20 years of hard use. Walnut's beautiful, but it marks. I think oak finished right. Tell him that. I did tell him that. He pushed back. What did you say? I said I'd build him a walnut table if he wanted one, and it would be beautiful for about 3 years. Or I'd build him an oak table, finished with a proper hardening oil that would look good for 20. His choice. Silas looked at her. What did he choose? He's thinking about it. She paused. He'll choose oak. He just needs to feel like he made the decision. Colbert chose oak. He also, while he was thinking about it, mentioned the table project to his neighbor, who mentioned it to someone in town. And by the time the Colbert table was framed up and drying in the workshop, there were 2 more inquiries, one for a set of kitchen chairs, one for a bookcase, with a specific unusual dimension that was actually an interesting problem. The interesting problem was Silas's favorite kind. He spent 2 evenings working out how to execute the unusual dimension. The client wanted a bookcase to fit an alcove that was neither square nor consistently wide, narrowing by almost 2 inches from top to bottom because of an old settlement issue in the wall, and he brought the solution to Lenora, who looked at his sketch and said, "What about this joint here?" and pointed at a connection he'd been uncertain about, and she was right that it needed rethinking. And they spent another hour on it together, and the second version was better than the first. This became the pattern. Not always that specific sequence, but the general quality of it, both of them in the workshop, both of them contributing, neither of them decorative. Lenora ran the client side and the accounts and brought him problems that needed solving. Silas solved them and built them and came back to her with questions about what would serve the client best. They argued regularly about specifics because they were 2 people with strong opinions about craft, and the arguments were almost always productive, and occasionally one of them was wrong and admitted it, and occasionally they were both partially right and found the third thing, and occasionally they were at an impasse for 2 days. And then one of them came around, and the one who came around was about equally distributed between them. Garrick watched this from a comfortable distance. He was rebuilding the warehouse through the winter, using Silas's plans, managing the construction the way he managed everything decisively, with specific questions and a low tolerance for vague answers. He stopped in at the workshop most mornings, looked at whatever was in progress, asked 1 or 2 questions, and went back to his own work. He and Silas had developed the specific ease of 2 men who had assessed each other through conflict and come out the other side with a clear view of who the other was. They didn't perform a relationship. They had one. January came in hard. The way Colorado January did a week of cold that made the workshop difficult to heat and made the wood behave strangely, contracting overnight and expanding by mid-morning in ways that required constant checking. Silas learned the workshop's temperature patterns, the way he learned all buildings by being in it through different conditions, until the patterns were as familiar as his own habits. He was working on the chair set late in the 2nd week of January, when Lenora came in from the house with her coat on and her notebook in her hand and a look on her face that he'd learned to read as the forerunner of a significant piece of information. "Sit down," she said. He was already sitting on the bench. He looked at her. "We have a commission inquiry from the Henderson family," she said. Henderson was the mill owner, the one who'd been decent to Silas in town, even when Preston's rumors had shifted other people's manner. They want a full bedroom set. Bed frame, 2 side tables, a wardrobe, and a dressing table. She paused. They also want to know if we'd consider taking on 2 apprentices from their family. They're boys, 17 and 19. They've been working the mill, but there's more interest in furniture work. Silas looked at her. "That's not an inquiry. That's a business development conversation." "Yes, it is." She sat on the overturned crate, the same crate which had followed the workshop move and which neither of them had consciously decided to keep, but which had become a fixed piece of the workshop's furniture. "If we take apprentices, we need a formal structure for it. Wages, hours, what we're teaching, and in what sequence. It changes the size of what we're doing. Is that what you want?" She looked around the workshop, the shelves, the tools, the Colbert table frame curing in the corner, the chair parts in their careful stages. She looked at it the way she'd looked at the carriage house on that first day he'd brought the lamp in seeing the future of it, what it was turning into. "I want it to be real," she said. Not just us two and a few commissions. I want it to be something that's here in 20 years. Then yes to the apprentices, he said, with proper structure. I'll write to the Hendersons this week. She wrote to the Hendersons. They came to the workshop the following week, the mill owner, his wife, and the two boys, who were big and quiet, and looked at the workshop with the particular attention of young people who recognize something they want without yet having the words for it. Lenora showed them through the space, explained what the work involved, and asked them both direct questions about what they already knew and what they didn't. Silas watched her manage the meeting with the same quality of attention she brought to everything specific, unhurried, reading what was actually in the room rather than what was supposed to be there. The older boy, whose name was Carl, knew more about wood than he'd presented initially. He'd been working the mill for 2 years and had been paying attention, which Silas recognized because you could see it in the way Carl's eyes moved across a piece of lumber, the quick, practiced sighting that you couldn't fake. "You've been looking at grain," Silas said to him at one point. Carl looked at him. "Since I was 15, my father doesn't know why I look at it so long. Because the grain tells you what the wood wants to do. If you listen to it, you work with it. If you don't, you spend your whole career fighting material that had a better idea than you did." Carl was quiet for a moment. "My father thinks I'm slow." "You're not slow, you're reading. Those are different things." Silas looked at Lenora. She was watching the exchange with the expression of someone confirming something she'd already suspected. The Hendersons left with an arrangement in place. The boys would start in February, 3 days a week to begin, moving to full days as the work warranted. The Henderson Bedroom Commission was confirmed. There was a handshake and a brief exchange about lumber pricing at the mill that ended with Henderson offering a standing arrangement that would benefit both operations. And Lenora wrote it all down in her notebook with the running fluency of a woman who had been managing accounts her whole life and was now managing them for something that was actually hers. The sign for the workshop was the last unresolved detail, which had been unresolved not through neglect but through the specific stubbornness of a man who kept looking at his draft and finding it incomplete. Silas had made the sign in the second week of January, a good piece of oak, 3 feet long, letters cut clean and deep, with a small detail at each end that was purely aesthetic but felt earned. He'd hung it above the workshop door on a cold Tuesday morning and stood back and looked at it. It said Corbett Workshop in plain letters, which was what it had said in his mind for the months he'd been thinking about it, and it looked right. And he went inside and started on the day's work, and didn't think about it again until late afternoon when Lenora came out from the house and stopped in the yard and looked at the sign. She stood there for a moment. Then she came inside and said nothing about it, which should have been a signal, but he was in the middle of a tricky joint and didn't track it. That evening at supper, Garrick said, without a particular emphasis, "Sign looks good." And then he looked at his plate, and Silas caught something at the edge of Garrick's expression that looked like suppressed amusement, and he thought, suddenly and clearly, that he had made an error. He looked at Lenora. She was eating. She raised her eyes and met his, and the expression in them was patient and waiting and entirely composed. He set down his fork, the sign. "What about it?" she said pleasantly. "I left something out. Did you?" "I did." She waited. "I'll fix it tomorrow," he said. "Take your time," she said, in the tone of a woman who meant the opposite. He fixed it that evening after supper in the workshop by lamplight. He took the sign down and carried it to his bench and looked at it for a while, thinking about the letters, the spacing, the depth, how to fit what needed fitting without crowding the existing work. Then he picked up his gouge and began. It took 2 hours. The lettering was the slowest kind of work, the kind where the margin for error was 0 and the tool had to move with complete commitment or the cut went wrong. He did it without rushing, the way he did everything that mattered. When he was done, he held the sign up in the lamplight and looked at it. Then he went to the door and called across the yard to the house. Lenora came out in her coat, which meant she'd been expecting the call. She crossed the yard and stood in the workshop doorway and looked at the sign in his hands. He handed it to her. She held it up in the lamplight. Corbett T. and Holloway Carpentry and Design, she studied it. She ran her thumb along the letters of her name, not checking the quality, he knew, just feeling them exist. The spacing between the ampersand and Holloway, she said. He looked. She was right. The spacing was off by a hair. Not significant, not visible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. But she was looking for it. I'll close it up, he said. In the morning. In the morning, he agreed. She handed the sign back to him and looked at it one more time. Then she looked at him. Whatever was in her expression in that moment was the kind of thing that doesn't have a name or has too many names and would have been reduced by any of them. He didn't try to name it. He just received it. Better, she said. He hung the corrected sign the next morning. The spacing was right. He stood back and looked at it in the winter light. The letters clean and deep, both names equally present, and thought that this was as good a thing as he'd built, not the finest work of his hands, not the most technically demanding, but the truest, the one that meant the most. The Colbert table was delivered in February, carried in the back of Dawson's wagon to the Colbert ranch, and set up in the dining room by Silas and Carl together, with Carl proving more useful than decorative on the heavy lift. Colbert's wife ran her hand along the oak surface and said, "It's warmer than I expected it to be," which was not a technical compliment, but was the best kind, the kind that meant the work had reached past the craft into something the person felt rather than assessed. Colbert himself thumped the table with his fist twice, the way men do when they're checking something without admitting they're checking it, and nodded. "That's not moving," he said. "No," Silas said, "it's not." By spring, the workshop had 6 active commissions and 2 more in negotiation. Carl and his brother James had progressed past the basic sequences and were developing their own specific abilities, Carl for precision work, James for the heavier structural pieces, where brute accuracy mattered more than fine detail. Lenora was managing 4 client relationships simultaneously and had started keeping a formal ledger that was, Silas noted when he looked at it once, considerably more organized than anything he'd ever attempted to maintain on his own behalf. Red Willow had recalibrated. Towns do that. They take in new information and update their picture, and the process isn't always graceful, but it happens. The merchants who had been cold to Silas in the weeks after Preston's Whisper campaign were not all warm now, but most were neutral, which was sufficient, and a few were actively friendly, which was more than he needed. Henderson at the mill had become a genuine business ally. The feed store owner's wife, who had been one of the original vehicles for Preston's rumors, commissioned a kitchen cabinet from the workshop in March and told Lenora she'd heard only good things, which was the kind of social revision that Lenora accepted without comment and Silas found privately entertaining. Garrick finished the warehouse reconstruction in April. The new east wall was better than the original Silas had drawn it. Garrick had executed it, and the loading dock configuration solved a problem the previous layout had created for 20 years without anyone quite naming it. Garrick walked the finished building the morning it was complete and came to the workshop afterward. He stood in the doorway. Silas was teaching Carl a mortise cut. Lenora was at the corner desk with her ledger. "Warehouse is done," Garrick said. Silas looked up. "The east wall, exactly as drawn." Garrick paused. "I've been thinking I owe you an honest accounting." Silas waited. "I spent a long time managing this place by deciding what people needed before I asked them. Lenora, the hands, the business contacts. I was efficient at it. I thought efficiency was the same as wisdom." He looked at the workshop, the tools, the 2 young men learning, his daughter at the ledger. "It isn't." "No," Silas said. "You stayed when I gave you every reasonable reason to leave. And the place is better for it." He said it plainly. He wasn't a man who ornamented his reckonings. "I wanted to say that out loud." Silas looked at him. "I didn't stay to prove anything to you." "I know. That's part of why it's worth saying." Garrick nodded once, in the way of a man who has said the thing he came to say and doesn't need to extend it further, and went back to his own work. Carl looked at Silas after Garrick left. "He always liked that?" "Getting there," Silas said. Back to the mortise. The oak board from Lenora's bed frame, the first one, the one Silas had pulled from the stack in those early days because of the cup in the grain, the board that Lenora had sighted down and confirmed was wrong, had been sitting in the corner of the workshop since the move. Not put away, not prominently displayed. Just there, leaning against the wall below the north window, present the way objects become present when they've been somewhere long enough. One evening in late spring, Silas put it up. He fitted 2 small brackets and hung the board on the wall at eye height, where he could see it from the bench. It was just a board cupped, flawed, pulled, because it would have been wrong in a finished piece. Not useful, not beautiful in any conventional sense. Lenora came in the next morning and saw it. She stood looking at it for a moment. "That's the first one," she said. "Yes." "The one I cited down." "Yes." She looked at it. "Why is it up?" Silas thought about how to answer that in a way that was honest without being more than the moment required. "Because it's the beginning of the thing," he said. "Not the best piece, not the proudest work, just the first one. The one that was there when I started figuring out what this was." Lenora looked at the board for another moment. Then she looked at him. "You're more sentimental than you let on. Don't tell anyone." She smiled the real one and went to the desk and opened her ledger, and the day began the way most days began, with work and the ordinary texture of a life in motion. But the board stayed on the wall, and Silas glanced at it sometimes when he was working on something difficult, not for any reason he could have cleanly articulated, but in the way that certain things become anchors not because they were the best moments, but because they were the real ones. There is something that Silas Corbett learned, in the particular way that people learn the things that matter not all at once, not from being told, but slowly, through the accumulation of evidence until the conclusion was undeniable. He had believed, for 9 years, that moving was a kind of honesty, that a man who didn't pretend to belong anywhere was at least not pretending. He had been wrong about that, and the wrongness of it was not dramatic. Nobody had to point it out to him with great ceremony. He had simply arrived in a place where staying was available as a real option, and he had discovered that the discipline he'd thought was freedom was actually fear with good posture. Fear of being somewhere and being insufficient for it, of being known and found wanting, of building something for someone who actually saw you building it, which was entirely different from building something for someone who only looked at the result. Lenora saw him building. She always had. That was the whole of it. She was not an easy person. She was right too often and knew it, and her patience for the long version of a conversation she'd already understood was limited. And she could be quiet in a way that communicated disappointment more effectively than most people's loudest complaints. She was also the most genuinely capable person he'd ever worked alongside, and the most honest, and the kind of honest that didn't soften its edges to spare you, which was the only kind worth having. He was not easy either. He knew that. He was slow to speak about the things that mattered and too precise about the things that didn't. And his habit of solving problems with his hands rather than his words sometimes left conversations with work that needed to be done still sitting on the bench. He was getting better at it, slowly, with the same attention he brought to the rest of the work. The sign above the workshop door said both their names. Not his with hers added as an afterthought, both equally, in the same depth of cut, the same quality of letter. He had made it that way on purpose. He had thought about it for 2 hours in the lamplight before the gouge touched the wood, and he had decided that if a thing was true, the artifact of it should tell the truth clearly. That was the lesson, if there was one. Not that love conquers obstacles, or that good men always win, or that the right person will change who you are. Those were comfortable versions of something more difficult and more true. The real thing was simpler and harder, that what you build reflects what you actually believe is worth building. That you can spend a lifetime doing excellent work for people you'll never see again, and the excellence is real. But the absence of investment is also real, and the thing you make without investment is always missing something that the person who receives it can feel even if they can't name it. And that, sometimes not always, but sometimes the thing that keeps you moving is not freedom, but the fear of finding out what happens when you stop. Silas Corbett stopped. He built something. It held. Years later, Lenora would walk into the workshop on an ordinary morning, not a significant day, not an anniversary, just a Tuesday in October, with cold coming down from the north and the smell of sawdust and linseed oil in the air, and she would stop in the doorway and look at the board on the wall, the cupped oak board from the first bed frame. And she would think about a man who had arrived with a tool chest and a habit of leaving and had somehow been persuaded to put the tool chest down. Not persuaded, exactly. That wasn't right. He hadn't needed persuading. He had needed a reason, and she had provided one. and he had had the sense to recognize it for what it was. She would think about her mother, who had wanted to be an architect and had drawn furniture instead, and she would think that her mother would have liked. Silas would have liked the way he read a piece of wood and the way he listened when a design had something to say. She would think that some things that were meant to exist simply take a while to find their conditions, the way certain joints need time and pressure before they set. And she would go to her desk and open her ledger and begin the day's work, because the work was always there, and it was always worth doing, and that was the most honest thing she knew. Silas Corbett arrived in Red Willow believing that every job eventually ended, and every door he built was ultimately someone else's. He left the bunkhouse and moved his tool chest into a workshop, with his name on the door, his name, and another name equally. In letters he'd cut himself by lamplight on a January night, when he finally understood what he'd been trying to finish for 9 years. Not the work, never just the work, the life behind it, the person doing it, and the person watching, and the particular gravity of a place that holds you because you've actually decided, not drifted or defaulted or been unable to leave to stay. That is what it means to build something worth keeping. Not that it's perfect, not that it doesn't have a board somewhere with a cup in the grain, pulled and set aside and hung on the wall later as a reminder, but that it was made with care for someone who could see the care, and it was made to last.